5 bullets tore through the luxury Porsche Cayenne on Tadashivska Street in downtown Kyiv. Head, abdomen, thigh. The gunfire echoed off the Soviet-era buildings as Oleksandr Semenov, known in Ukraine's underworld as Katsap, slumped dead in the driver's seat. It was late evening, October 6, 2009, and the killer had just executed one of the most brazen hits in Ukrainian criminal history. Within hours, investigators would arrest a suspect, a rising crime boss from Lviv Oblast named Andriy Nedzelsky. But this was Ukraine, where money talks louder than justice, and Nedzelsky walked free. No evidence, they said. Case closed. What the prosecutors didn't know was that the man they released would become one of Eastern Europe's most powerful thieves-in-law, controlling criminal empires from Lviv to Kyiv, building millions through illegal amber mining, and playing a deadly game of cat-and-mouse with law enforcement across 4 countries. This is the story of Nedelya, the Ukrainian crime lord who allegedly murdered his business partner, got crowned without serving a day in prison, survived a brutal hotel ambush, and now lives freely in Italy while Ukrainian courts try him in absentia for murder. The man who would become Nedelya was born Andriy Stepanovich Nedzelsky on March 1, 1973, in Stary Sambir, a small town in Lviv Oblast with barely 6,500 residents. There was nothing in his early years that screamed future crime lord. He started out like thousands of other young Ukrainians in the chaotic 1990s, hustling, surviving, looking for opportunities in the wreckage of the Soviet collapse. Nedzelsky sold used cars, nothing glamorous, just enough to get by. But the 1990s in Ukraine were a special kind of hell. The old Soviet system had collapsed, leaving a vacuum where the state should have been. Into that vacuum rushed organized crime, corrupt officials, and ambitious young men willing to do whatever it took to grab power. Nedzelsky was one of them. Sometime in the late 1990s, he made the move that would change everything. He left provincial Lviv for the capital, Kyiv, where the real money flowed. In Kyiv, Nedzelsky entered the orbit of one of Ukraine's most influential thieves-in-law, Serhiy Mamedov, known simply as Mamed. This connection was everything. Mamed was old school, a respected figure in the criminal hierarchy, and being in his inner circle meant protection, connections, and opportunities. Through the 2000s, Nedzelsky learned the business, not just street-level racketeering, but the sophisticated operations that generated serious money. He built his reputation through violence and cunning. While he picked up the nickname Andriy Lvivsky, Andriy from Lviv, insiders knew another name would stick, Nedelya, meaning Sunday in Russian. The origin of this nickname remains unclear, but in the underworld, names matter less than results, and Nedzelsky was delivering results. July 17, 2008. Fredra Street, Lviv. Morning light filtered through the trees as unknown gunmen opened fire on businessman Ihor Kul'chytsky and his associate. Both men died on the spot, their blood pooling on the pavement. Kul'chytsky wasn't just any businessman. He controlled lucrative construction operations in Lviv and lived with the former wife of deceased racketeer Orest Zavinsky, nicknamed Zavinya. When Zavinsky died, Kul'chytsky allegedly took over managing the dead man's business empire. That made him a target. Ukrainian media immediately suspected Nedzelsky's involvement. The logic was simple. Kul'chytsky controlled valuable territory, and Nedzelsky was expanding his influence in western Ukraine. A public execution sent a message to anyone else thinking about resistance. But suspicion isn't evidence, and Ukrainian investigators never formally charged Nedzelsky with ordering the Kul'chytsky hit. The case went cold, joining thousands of other unsolved murders in Ukraine's overwhelmed justice system. Still, among those who knew, the message was received loud and clear. But the Kul'chytsky murder was just foreplay. The real drama began with Oleksandr Semenov. Semenov was a Russian criminal authority with a colorful nickname Katsap, a Ukrainian slang term for Russians that roughly translates to butcher or goat, depending on which etymology you believe. Semenov and Nedzelsky were business partners, running various schemes together in that murky world where crime and legitimate business blur into one. According to Ukrainian prosecutors, things went south over money, the oldest story in the criminal playbook. The investigators' version goes like this. Nedzelsky and Semenov were partners in some deal that went wrong. Money disappeared. Semenov suspected Nedzelsky of keeping funds that should have been shared. In the thieves' world, this was a serious accusation. Semenov threatened to bring the matter before other criminal authorities at a gathering, essentially accusing Nedzelsky of violating the code. For Nedzelsky, this was existential. If Semenov made his case to the right people, Nedzelsky's reputation would be destroyed. And in this world, reputation is everything. So Nedzelsky made his choice. October 6, 2009, Kyiv. Semenov sat in his Porsche Cayenne on Tarasivska Street, in the heart of Ukraine's capital. What happened next was execution, not murder. 5 bullets, head, abdomen, thigh. The shooter wanted to make absolutely sure. Ukrainian investigators believe Nedzelsky orchestrated the hit, possibly pulling the trigger himself, though they also considered accomplices. One name that emerged later was Sergei Kiselyev, a 51-year-old from Vinnytsia who went by Sergei Vinnytsky. Kiselyev was allegedly close to Nedzelsky and part of his organized crime group in the late 2000s. Interestingly, Kiselyev was the brother of a Ukrainian parliament deputy from the 9th Convocation, showing how organized crime in Ukraine often had family connections reaching into government. But in 2009, investigators couldn't make the case stick. Police arrested Nedzelsky shortly after the murder, but he walked free. Insufficient evidence, they said. No witnesses willing to talk. No forensic proof linking him directly to the scene. In Ukraine's broken justice system, this was normal. If you had money and connections, you could make problems disappear. Nedzelsky had both. The case file gathered dust while Nedzelsky continued building his empire. What investigators didn't realize was that they just released a man who would soon reach the very top of Ukraine's criminal hierarchy. November 2011 changed everything. Sergei Mamedov, Mamed, died of stomach cancer. He was 47 years old and had been one of Ukraine's most influential thieves-in-law. His death created a power vacuum that sucked in every ambitious criminal in the region. The prize was control of the Ukrainian obshchak, the common fund that all thieves contributed to and that financed operations, bribed officials, and supported imprisoned criminals' families. This wasn't pocket change. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly millions. Multiple factions wanted it. On one side were representatives from the Caucasus, Georgian and Azerbaijani thieves who saw Ukraine as their territory. On another side was Sergei Lysenko, a powerful thief-in-law from Sumy with the nickname Leda Sumskoy, who had backing from Russian criminals. Then there were Ukrainian-based thieves who thought the obshchak should stay under local control. The stage was set for war. By this point, Nedzelsky's authority had grown significantly. The Semenov murder, despite never being prosecuted, enhanced rather than damaged his reputation in certain circles. He'd shown he was willing to eliminate problems permanently. He'd demonstrated connections that kept him out of prison. Most importantly, he'd survived Mamed's death and positioned himself as a key player in the succession struggle. In May 2012, the major factions held a gathering in Kyiv to sort out the power structure. These meetings happened in expensive hotels or private venues, where thieves-in-law and criminal authorities gathered to make decisions affecting millions of dollars and hundreds of criminals. Present at this May 2012 gathering were several influential thieves-in-law, including Yuri Pichugin, known as Pichuga, and Sergei Lysenko, Leda Sumskoy. The decision was made. Andriy Nedzelsky would become the Watcher over Kyiv. This position meant he controlled criminal operations in Ukraine's capital, resolved disputes, collected tribute, and represented the interests of the thieves-in-law community. It was a massive promotion. But Nedzelsky wanted more. 5 months later, in October 2012, He traveled to Greece for what would become the defining moment of his criminal career, his coronation as a thief-in-law. The ceremony happened in secret, but word eventually filtered through the underworld. The thieves' approach, essentially the recommendation and sponsorship required to become a thief-in-law, was provided by David Sebiskverdza, an influential Georgian thief from Kul'chytsky who went by Dato Kul'chytsky or Varlamich. Having a respected Georgian vouch for you was significant. It meant acceptance by the broader criminal community across the former Soviet Union. The coronation elevated Nedzelsky into the criminal elite, giving him status equivalent to a made man in the Italian Mafia, but with even more restrictions and responsibilities. Here's where it gets interesting. Traditionally, you couldn't become a thief-in-law without serving serious prison time. The ideology behind the Thieves' Code emphasized prison as the crucible where true criminals were forged. You proved yourself in the brutal Soviet prison system, earned respect from other inmates, learned the traditions, and only then could senior thieves consider you for coronation. But Nedzelsky broke this rule. At the time of his October 2012 coronation, he had never served a prison sentence. Not one day. This was highly unusual and controversial. How did he pull it off? Money certainly helped. Connections mattered. But more than that, the thieves' world was changing. The old Soviet prison culture was fading. A new generation of criminals cared more about cash flow than tradition. If you controlled territory, generated revenue, and commanded respect through fear or charisma, maybe you didn't need a prison resume. Nedzelsky represented this new breed. With his new status came new responsibilities and opportunities. As a crowned thief-in-law controlling Kyiv, Nedzelsky oversaw a criminal empire spanning western and central Ukraine. His interests were diverse. According to law enforcement, he ran protection rackets over legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses. He controlled parts of Ukraine's shadow alcohol industry, where untaxed spirits generate enormous profits. But his most lucrative operation was probably illegal amber mining in Rivne Oblast. Ukraine sits on significant amber deposits, and illegal mining became a multi-million-dollar industry in the 2000s. Organized groups would illegally extract amber using high-pressure water pumps that devastated the landscape, then smuggle the amber out for sale in European and Asian markets. Nedzelsky allegedly controlled or took tribute from these operations. Media reports suggested he also oversaw smuggling channels along Ukraine's western border with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Routes used for everything from contraband cigarettes to human trafficking. The money flowed in, and Nedzelsky lived well. But he was also smart about it. He didn't flaunt wealth, obviously. He maintained the appearance of a successful businessman while operating in the shadows. Part of his money went into the obshchak, the common fund that maintained his status and relationships with other thieves. Ukrainian investigators would later seize over $400,000 in cash that they claimed was Nedzelsky's portion of the criminal fund, though proving the money's criminal origin was another matter. This seizure would trigger a massive corruption scandal involving Ukraine's Asset Recovery Agency, but that came later. For now, in 2012 and the years following, Nedzelsky was ascendant. He controlled Kyiv. He had status as a thief-in-law. His operations generated serious cash. He'd eliminated enemies like Semenov and gotten away with it. Ukrainian law enforcement knew who he was, but couldn't touch him. He had too many connections, too much money for bribes, too much street power. To his allies, he was a boss worthy of respect. To his enemies, he was a dangerous problem that needed solving. To Ukrainian society at large, he was mostly invisible. Just another name in the shadowy world of organized crime that operated parallel to normal life. But in the criminal underworld, what rises fast can fall faster. By 2016 and 2017, tensions were building. Nedzelsky's rapid rise had made enemies. His control over lucrative amber mining operations put him in conflict with Georgian criminal groups who wanted their cut. His unconventional path to becoming a thief-in-law crowned without prison time, gave traditionalists ammunition to question his legitimacy. And his growing power in Ukraine made him a target for rivals who saw him as overreaching. The Georgians who had crowned him in 2012 were starting to have second thoughts. Rumors circulated that Nedzelsky had connections to Ukrainian law enforcement, the ultimate betrayal in the thieves' code. Other whispers suggested he'd refused to help David Sebaskverdzi financially after Sebaskverdzi got out of Greek prison, a serious violation of the mutual aid obligations that thieves-in-law owed each other. The first major blow came in June 2017. A thieves' gathering in Greece brought together influential figures from across the criminal world. Leading the meeting were Georgian heavyweights, Dato Kul'chytsky himself, the same man who'd given Nedzelsky his criminal crown 5 years earlier, and Gaios Zviadze, known as Gia Kul'chytsky. The agenda included one critical item: Andriy Nedzelsky. The Georgians announced they were suspending Nedzelsky's status as a thief-in-law. This was devastating. Being suspended meant you lost your authority, your right to participate in criminal governance, your claim on the obszczak. It meant other criminals could refuse to deal with you or acknowledge your power. Nedzelsky didn't even attend this meeting. Whether he knew about it and chose to ignore it, or whether he was deliberately excluded, the message was clear. The Georgians were moving against him. Two versions of events circulated. One claimed Nedzelsky had refused financial help to Sebaskverdzi, violating the code of mutual support. Another suggested the Georgians accused Nedzelsky of working with Ukrainian security services, which, if true, would be grounds for execution, not just suspension. Days after this Greek gathering, French authorities arrested Nedzelsky in Nice. He was there conducting a real estate transaction, buying property on the French Riviera, as successful criminals do. The arrest was ostensibly related to his use of a fake Hungarian passport, part of a massive document fraud scheme that Ukrainian authorities in Uzhhorod had uncovered in 2016. This scheme systematically produced forged Hungarian passports for criminals and others wanting to travel in Europe without their real identity. Nedzelsky had used one of these fake documents to visit France. But the timing was suspicious. Days after the Georgians suspended his status, French police grabbed him. Coincidence? Or coordination between the criminal world and law enforcement? In this murky realm, the lines often blurred. Regardless, French authorities didn't hold him long. Within weeks, Nedzelsky was free again, though his legal troubles were mounting. Back in Ukraine, Nedzelsky still had his supporters and his operations. The Georgian suspension didn't automatically mean everyone recognized it as legitimate. Some Ukrainian thieves and criminals considered the move a power grab by the Georgians, an attempt to muscle in on Ukrainian territory. The criminal world split between those accepting the suspension and those backing Nedzelsky. This division would lead to violence. But first came something even more dramatic, an event that would become infamous in Ukrainian underworld circles. October 12, 2019. The Fairmont Grand Hotel in Kyiv, one of the city's most luxurious venues. A wedding celebration was underway for the family of Oleg Krapivin, a criminal authority known as Oleg Bakinsky. These gatherings were common in the criminal world, occasions where thieves-in-law, authorities, and their associates mixed business with pleasure. Nedzelsky attended, probably seeing it as an opportunity to maintain alliances and show he wasn't intimidated by the Georgian suspension 2 years earlier. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. According to investigators and media reports, a group of thieves-in-law attacked Nedzelsky during the celebration. The attackers included Serhiy Olinik, known as Umka, David Osmanov, Dato Krasnodarsky, and Nodar Asoyan, Nodar Rustavsky. These weren't random thugs, they were respected figures in the criminal hierarchy. The attack was brutal. Nedzelsky was beaten, humiliated in front of witnesses. After the assault, the attackers announced that Nedzelsky's status as a thief-in-law was suspended. This was the second suspension, and this time it happened publicly, with witnesses, in a context that carried maximum symbolic weight. Nedzelsky and his supporters immediately cried foul. They claimed the whole thing was a setup, a planned provocation organized by his enemies with help from corrupt law enforcement. According to this version, the attack violated every principle of the thieves' code. Disputes were supposed to be resolved through discussion at proper gatherings, not through ambushes at weddings. The fact that police didn't intervene or arrest anyone suggested official complicity. Nedzelsky's camp argued that the suspension was illegitimate, a violation of procedures that required proper adjudication before such a serious step. The Fairmont incident became a flashpoint. Some in the criminal world saw it as justified punishment for Nedzelsky's violations. Others saw it as a coordinated hit job that broke all the rules. The split deepened, and Nedzelsky's position became increasingly untenable. By 2020, Nedzelsky faced problems from multiple directions. The Georgians had suspended him. The Fairmont attack had damaged his reputation and authority. Ukrainian law enforcement was circling. In spring 2020, police made their move on the old Semenov case. More than a decade had passed since the murder, but investigators had kept working. They conducted new forensic tests on evidence. They analyzed phone records and travel patterns from 2009. They re-interviewed witnesses. The case they built was circumstantial but compelling. On May 26, 2020, Ukrainian police announced they were formally charging Nedzelsky with Semenov's murder. The charges included murder under aggravating circumstances, illegal weapons trafficking, and use of forged documents. Since Nedzelsky wasn't in custody, they issued the charges in absentia and placed him under arrest warrant. Ukrainian prosecutors requested Interpol issue an international warrant. Nedzelsky became a fugitive. Around the same time came the money scandal. On May 2020, law enforcement raided a bank safe deposit box registered to Sergei Kiselyev, Sergei Vinitsky. Remember him, the alleged accomplice in Semenov's murder? Inside the box, investigators found over $400,000 in cash. They immediately labeled it Nedzelsky's criminal obshchak, the common fund that proved his leadership of an organized criminal group. Kiselyev denied the money was criminal proceeds, claiming it was legitimate funds, but Ukrainian courts sided with prosecutors and ordered the money seized. What happened next was a corruption scandal that would dwarf the original seizure. The money fell under control of the National Agency of Ukraine for Finding, Tracing, and Management of Assets, ARMA, the government body responsible for managing seized criminal assets. Then, mysteriously, the money disappeared. Not physically, but legally. Forged court documents appeared, ordering the money transferred to a different person, Igor Korol. In 2021, prosecutors charged 3 top ARMA officials with embezzlement: Vitaly Shihidin, his deputy Volodymyr Pavlenko, and asset management chief Vakhtang Bochorishvili. They also charged 2 lawyers, Oksana Sirokurova and Denis Serduk, with participating in the scheme. According to prosecutors, these officials and lawyers worked together to create fake court orders, transfer the seized $400,000 to Korol, and, presumably, split the proceeds. The case exposed massive corruption in Ukraine's asset recovery system. Meanwhile, Kiselyev fought a parallel legal battle claiming the money was rightfully his, not Nedzelsky's. As of 2024, this saga continues in Ukrainian courts, with the money's ultimate fate still unresolved. But by May 2020, Nedzelsky wasn't sticking around to fight these battles in person. He left Ukraine using forged documents, probably another fake Hungarian passport or similar. His exact route isn't public, but he ended up in Greece, a favored destination for Eastern European criminals. Greece offered warm weather, lax enforcement, and a large enough expatriate community for criminals to blend in. Throughout late 2020 and early 2021, journalists and investigators spotted Nedzelsky living openly in Athens. He wasn't hiding in some remote village. He dined at expensive restaurants in central Athens, almost daily according to some accounts. It was brazen, an international fugitive wanted for murder, living openly in a European capital, apparently unconcerned about arrest. The Greek authorities either didn't know, didn't care, or were being paid not to notice. In May 2021, Ukraine escalated. The National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine imposed personal sanctions against more than 500 individuals identified as thieves-in-law or connected to organized crime. Nedzelsky was on this list. The sanctions meant asset freezes, travel bans, and other restrictions, though enforcing these against people already operating outside the law was questionable. Still, it showed Ukrainian authorities were serious about cracking down, at least symbolically. For Nedzelsky, the net was tightening. He had murder charges, international warrants, sanctions, and enemies in both the criminal world and law enforcement. Something had to give. August 7, 2021, Sofia Airport, Bulgaria. Customs officers conducting routine passport checks on arriving passengers flagged one traveler. The passport looked wrong. Under questioning, the truth emerged. Andriy Nedzelsky had tried entering Bulgaria with forged travel documents. Bulgarian authorities arrested him immediately and notified Interpol. Ukraine requested extradition. This should have been the end of the road. Bulgaria is an EU member with functioning extradition treaties. Nedzelsky was caught red-handed with fake documents. He was wanted for murder in Ukraine. But the Bulgarian legal system moved slowly, and Nedzelsky had money for lawyers. The court released him on bail pending extradition hearings, and then, predictably, he disappeared. Bail paid, Nedzelsky vanished from Bulgaria before the extradition could proceed. Ukrainian authorities were furious but helpless. Once again, their target had slipped away. For months, Nedzelsky's location remained unknown. Then came March 28, 2022, northern Italy. Italian law enforcement, acting on international warrants, arrested Andriy Nedzelsky. The exact circumstances weren't fully publicized, but he was taken into custody and transferred to a prison in Aosta, a small city in the Italian Alps near the French border. This time, it seemed, Nedzelsky's luck had run out. Aosta prison sits in the Italian Alps, surrounded by snow-capped mountains and medieval architecture. It's a long way from the streets of Kyiv and Lviv. For Andriy Nedzelsky, the cold, gray walls of the Italian detention facility must have felt like the end of the line. He'd evaded justice for over a decade, walked free after the Semenov murder, expanded his criminal empire, survived the Georgian suspension and the Fairmont beating, slipped away from Bulgarian authorities. But Italy had him now, and Ukraine was pushing hard for extradition. The Italian justice system moved deliberately, carefully, with all the procedural safeguards of a Western European democracy. Nedzelsky sat in his cell, waiting while lawyers filed motions and courts reviewed evidence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. 6 months he spent in Aosta prison, from late March 2022 through September 2022. During this time, Ukrainian prosecutors were building their extradition case, compiling evidence of the Semenov murder, the forged passports, the organized crime connections. But Nedzelsky wasn't sitting idle. He hired excellent lawyers, and in Italy, excellent lawyers can work miracles. The lead attorney was Flavio Campagna, based in Turin, one of the country's major legal centers. Campagna's job was simple on paper, but complex in execution. Prevent extradition to Ukraine at all costs. He had several arguments to work with. First, questions about whether Ukrainian courts could guarantee fair trial and humane prison conditions. European courts are cautious about extraditing people to countries where justice systems don't meet EU standards, and Ukraine, in 2022, was also dealing with the Russian invasion, adding chaos to an already strained system. Second, procedural challenges to the Ukrainian evidence and charges. Third, the possibility of claiming Nedzelsky faced political persecution rather than legitimate prosecution. These arguments take time to resolve, and time was what Nedzelsky needed. September 16, 2022, brought unexpected news. The Turin Court of Appeals ruled that Nedzelsky should be released from custody pending final resolution of the extradition case. This wasn't a decision on extradition itself, just on whether he needed to remain imprisoned while courts decided. The judges apparently concluded that he wasn't an immediate flight risk, a darkly ironic assessment given his history of disappearing after being released on bail in Bulgaria. Or perhaps the judges simply followed Italian law regarding pre-trial detention limits. Regardless of the reasoning, Nedzelsky walked out of Aosta prison after 6 months inside. He didn't go far. Italian law required him to maintain a registered address, and that address became his lawyer Campagna's office in Turin. Technically, Nedzelsky was still in legal limbo, waiting for courts to decide his fate. Practically, he was free to move around Italy with certain restrictions. Shortly after his release, the Italian newspaper La Repubblica published an article examining Nedzelsky's case and his extradition prospects. The piece brought public attention to the presence of a Ukrainian organized crime boss on Italian soil. It discussed his criminal background, the murder charges, his status in the thieves-in-law hierarchy. The article was detailed enough to suggest someone had leaked information to the press, possibly from law enforcement or prosecution. Was this pressure tactic to influence the courts, or was it investigative journalism doing its job? Either way, the publicity didn't immediately change Nedzelsky's situation. The legal process ground forward slowly. November 2022 brought another development. Italy's Cassation Court, the highest court in the Italian judicial system, reviewed the lower court's decision on extradition. They canceled the previous ruling and ordered the case sent back for new review. This meant starting parts of the process over, more hearings, more arguments, more delays. For Nedzelsky, this was good news. Every delay meant more time free in Italy rather than imprisoned in Ukraine. For Ukrainian prosecutors, it was maddening frustration. They'd built what they considered a solid case. They had evidence linking Nedzelsky to Semenov's murder, proof of forged documents, documentation of organized crime activity. But Italian courts moved at their own pace, and Ukrainian demands couldn't accelerate the process. The next major hearing was scheduled for January 23, 2024. This would supposedly be the final decision on whether to extradite Nedzelsky to Ukraine. Prosecutors and investigators waited anxiously. January 2024 came and went. No public announcement of a decision emerged. No court ruling appeared in official records. No news coverage reported an outcome. As of late 2024 and into 2025, the status of Italy's extradition decision remains unclear from public sources. What is clear is that Nedzelsky remains in Italy. His legal address is still listed as his Turin lawyer's office. He hasn't been extradited. He hasn't been arrested again. The Italian legal system continues protecting his rights as a defendant, while Ukrainian prosecutors continue pushing for his transfer. This limbo could potentially last years, with appeals and counter-appeals cycling through multiple levels of Italian courts. While the Italian courts deliberated, the criminal underworld hadn't forgotten about Nedzelsky. Remember, the Georgians had suspended his status in 2017, and the Fairmont incident in 2019 had publicly humiliated him. For 2 years after Fairmont, Nedzelsky existed in a strange state, still claiming to be a thief-in-law, still controlling some operations and loyalists, but with his legitimacy seriously questioned. Then came news that changed everything. In October 2023, a secret gathering took place in southern Croatia, along the Adriatic coast, where luxury villas offer privacy and beautiful views. This wasn't a random meeting. The criminal elite had assembled under the leadership of 2 of the most powerful thieves-in-law in the post-Soviet space, Merab Jangveladze and Tariel Oniani. These weren't minor players. These were men who controlled criminal networks across multiple countries, who commanded respect from hundreds of criminals, who settled disputes involving millions of dollars. The agenda included several items, but one stood out: what to do about Andriy Nedzelsky. His supporters argued that the 2017 Georgian suspension was procedurally flawed, that the Fairmont attack violated proper protocols, that Nedzelsky deserved a fair hearing rather than ambush and beatings. His opponents maintained that he'd violated the code through connections with law enforcement and failure to provide mutual aid. The gathering heard arguments, reviewed evidence such as it was, and discussed options. According to sources familiar with the meeting's outcome, the decision went in Nedzelsky's favor. His status as a thief-in-law was confirmed in full. The 2019 suspension was effectively reversed. His actions since the Fairmont incident, including maintaining discipline despite persecution, apparently satisfied enough of the gathered criminals that they decided to restore him. But this restoration came at a price, and the price was steep. Multiple sources suggest Nedzelsky had to make significant concessions. One claim is that he agreed to hand over lists to his criminal colleagues, potentially information about his operations, his associates, his financial structures. This would give other thieves leverage over him, ensuring his future cooperation and preventing him from going rogue. Another condition allegedly involved the Fairmont attackers. Nedzelsky wanted revenge, naturally, but he couldn't just order hits on other thieves-in-law. The Croatian gathering's decision reportedly included a promise that the Fairmont attackers would eventually be called to account, but only after they'd been given opportunity to present their version of events at a proper gathering. This was cold comfort for Nedzelsky. It meant no immediate revenge, just a vague future promise. Critically, the Croatian restoration had heavyweight backing. Zachary Kul'chytsky, known as Shakro Molodoi, young Shakro, threw his support behind confirming Nedzelsky's status. Kul'chytsky is considered one of the most influential thieves-in-law in Russia and perhaps the entire post-Soviet space. His word carries enormous weight. If Shakro backed Nedzelsky, then opposing camps had to think carefully about continuing their challenge. This support didn't necessarily mean Kul'chytsky liked Nedzelsky or thought him innocent of the accusations. In the criminal world, politics matter as much as principles. Perhaps Kul'chytsky saw an advantage in having Nedzelsky obligated to him. Perhaps there were other considerations invisible to outsiders. Regardless, the Croatian gathering ended with Nedzelsky's position restored, his status as thief-in-law reconfirmed, his authority partially rebuilt. For Nedzelsky, this was vindication of sorts. Despite being stuck in Italy, despite facing murder charges in Ukraine, despite years of attacks on his legitimacy, the criminal world's highest authorities had ruled in his favor. He could again claim full status as a thief-in-law. His supporters in Ukraine could operate under his authority without questioning whether that authority was legitimate. His access to criminal networks and resources was restored. Of course, this meant nothing to Ukrainian law enforcement, who didn't recognize the legitimacy of thieves-in-law hierarchy anyway. But within the underworld, it mattered tremendously. Nedzelsky was back, at least symbolically. While Nedzelsky navigated criminal politics from Italy, Ukrainian prosecutors were moving forward with the murder case. They'd completed their investigation in late 2022. The evidence file was massive. Phone records from 2009 showing communications between Nedzelsky and various associates around the time of Semenov's murder. Forensic analysis of the crime scene and ballistics, witness statements, including some from people who'd initially been too afraid to talk. Financial records showing motive related to the disputed money. Travel records placing Nedzelsky in Kyiv when the murder occurred. The case was circumstantial. No smoking gun, no video of the shooting, no confession. But prosecutors believed they had enough for conviction. December 5, 2022 marked a turning point. Investigators formally announced completion of the pre-trial investigation. Under Ukrainian law, this meant the evidence-gathering phase was over. The defense was notified and given access to review all materials in the case file. Nedzelsky's lawyers had until March 10, 2023 to examine these materials and prepare their defense strategy. Of course, their client was in Italy and had no intention of showing up for trial, but the legal process moved forward regardless. Ukrainian law allows special proceedings in absentia for serious crimes when the defendant is deliberately evading justice. Prosecutors requested permission from the court to proceed with trial even though Nedzelsky wouldn't be physically present. March 20th, 2024, Oleksandr District Court, Kyiv. The courtroom was probably half empty, just prosecutors, a few journalists, maybe some observers. The defendant's chair sat vacant. Prosecutor Yevgeny Kalinin from the Prosecutor General's office stood to read the indictment against 51-year-old Andriy Stepanovich Nedzelsky, resident of Sambir district, known in criminal circles as thief-in-law, with nicknames Andriy Lvivsky and Nedelya. The charges were laid out methodically. Count 1. Murder under aggravating circumstances, specifically premeditated murder of Oleksandr Semenov committed by 2 or more persons and in a manner dangerous to others. Violations of Articles 115, Part 2, Points 6 and 12 of Ukraine's Criminal Code. Count 2. Illegal trafficking in firearms, ammunition, or explosives, Article 263, Part 1. Count 3. Use of knowingly forged documents, Article 358, Part 4. Each charge carried serious prison time. If convicted on all counts, Nedzelsky faced life imprisonment. The trial proceeding in absentia is surreal. Prosecutors present evidence to a judge, knowing the defendant is thousands of kilometers away. They call witnesses who testify to an empty chair. They submit documents that the accused will never directly examine. Defense lawyers argue points without being able to consult their client in real time. The process follows all normal legal procedures, but with a fundamental absence at its core. Ukrainian law allows this in cases where defendants are deliberately avoiding trial, preventing fugitives from escaping justice simply by fleeing the country. If convicted in absentia, the sentence would be registered, and if Nedzelsky were ever captured or returned to Ukraine, he'd immediately begin serving it. The Semenov murder case prosecutors presented was straightforward in outline but complex in detail. October 6, 2009, late evening, central Kyiv. Oleksandr Semenov sat in his Porsche Cayenne on Tadasivska Street. He was probably waiting for someone, maybe talking on the phone, unaware these were his final moments. The prosecution theory was that Nedzelsky, possibly with Kiselev and potentially others, approached the vehicle. 5 shots fired, head, abdomen, thigh. Semenov died almost instantly. The killers fled. The motive was money and reputation. Semenov threatened to expose Nedzelsky's theft of shared criminal proceeds, so Nedzelsky eliminated the threat permanently. The evidence included the forensic reports from the crime scene, testimony from people who knew about the financial dispute between the two men, phone records showing contact between Nedzelsky and associates around the time of the murder, and expert analysis of the murder method, suggesting professional criminal execution rather than random violence. The defense strategy, conducted by Nedzelsky's lawyers in his absence, challenged the evidence quality. They argued the phone records proved nothing conclusive. They questioned whether witnesses had credible knowledge or were just repeating rumors. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence directly linking Nedzelsky to the trigger. They noted that the case had been opened and closed multiple times over 15 years, suggesting weakness in the prosecution's case. If the evidence was so strong, why did it take until 2020 to charge Nedzelsky? Why was he released after the initial 2009 arrest? These were fair questions, and Ukrainian courts would have to weigh them against the prosecution's evidence. As the trial proceeded through 2024, various complications arose. On September 26, 2024, an appellate hearing was scheduled in a different case, Nedzelsky's lawsuit against Ukraine's Ministry of Internal Affairs. This lawsuit dated back to November 2021, when then Interior Minister Denis Monastyrsky made public statements about Nedzelsky's criminal activities. Nedzelsky sued, claiming these statements violated his honor, dignity, and business reputation, and that Monastyrsky had violated the presumption of innocence by publicly labeling him a criminal before any conviction. Lower courts had rejected this lawsuit, and the September 2024 hearing was an appeal of that rejection. But something unusual happened. During the hearing, air raid sirens sounded in Kyiv. This was 2024 Ukraine, under regular Russian missile attacks. When sirens sound, proceedings pause, people move to shelters, life stops until the all clear. The hearing continued or concluded during this alert period, and Nedzelsky's attorney wasn't able to participate properly. Later, Nedzelsky's legal team appealed to Ukraine's Supreme Court, arguing that conducting the hearing during an air raid without his lawyer present violated his procedural rights. In a decision that might seem technical but was actually significant, the Supreme Court agreed. They ruled that the circumstances limited the plaintiff's and his representative's rights to participate in the appellate review, providing sufficient grounds to return the case for new consideration. The lawsuit was sent back to the appeals court for a new hearing under proper conditions. This wasn't a victory on the merits for Nedzelsky. The courts hadn't said Monastyrsky's statements were wrong or defamatory, but it was a procedural win, showing his lawyers were fighting on every available front. The lower court's reasoning for rejecting Nedzelsky's defamation lawsuit was telling. The October 2024 decision from Kyiv's appellate court stated, "The person of Nedzelsky is not known to the general public, and details of his life do not arouse personal interest." Accordingly, the court had no grounds to believe that during the communication of the disputed information, the person under the conditional name Nedelya was perceived by the general public specifically as Nedzelsky. Therefore, the court of first instance had no grounds to conclude that the disputed information violated his rights and the principle of presumption of innocence. In other words, the court argued Nedzelsky wasn't famous enough for the minister's statements to damage his reputation. When Monastyrsky talked about Nedelya, the thief-in-law, ordinary Ukrainians wouldn't necessarily connect that to Andriy Nedzelsky, the individual, so no defamation occurred. This was a creative legal argument that essentially said you can't defame someone the public doesn't know. Meanwhile, the separate criminal case against Sergei Kiselyev continued. Remember, Kiselyev was the alleged accomplice in Semenov's murder, the man whose safe deposit box contained the $400,000 that sparked the Arma corruption scandal. Investigators registered a criminal case against him in 2022, apparently split off from the main Nedzelsky prosecution. The charges alleged Kiselyev was probably involved in the commission of intentional murder of Oleksandr Semenov. This separate prosecution suggested investigators believed multiple people participated in the killing, with Nedzelsky as the organizer or primary shooter and Kiselyev as accomplice or second gunman. Kiselyev's connection to a Ukrainian parliament member, his brother served in the 9th Convocation, added another layer to the story, showing how organized crime in Ukraine often had tentacles reaching into government. The $400,000 itself remained in legal purgatory. After Arma officials and lawyers were charged with embezzling it through forged court documents, the money's status became unclear. Multiple court cases proceeded simultaneously. The criminal prosecution of the Arma officials, civil cases about ownership of the funds, appeals and counter-appeals about whether the original seizure was legal. Kiselyev claimed the money was legitimately his, seized improperly. Prosecutors maintained it was criminal proceeds from Nedzelsky's organization. The person who allegedly received the money through the forged documents, Igor Korol, was presumably also involved in litigation. Ukrainian courts in 2024 were still sorting through these competing claims. In July 2024, an appeals court canceled some previous decision regarding the 14.5 million hryvnias, the Ukrainian currency equivalent of the $400,000, sending yet another aspect of the case back for reconsideration. The likelihood of anyone actually getting their hands on this money in the near future seemed remote. From his position in Italy, Nedzelsky watched these Ukrainian legal proceedings with the detachment of someone beyond their reach. The in absentia trial could result in conviction and life sentence, but that only mattered if he ever returned to Ukrainian custody. The Arma corruption scandal was embarrassing for Ukraine, but didn't directly threaten him. The Kyiv prosecution might eventually reveal more details about the Semenov murder, but Kyiv presumably wasn't cooperating with prosecutors, or he'd already have testified against Nedzelsky. The defamation lawsuit against the Interior Ministry was a sideshow, more about principle and harassment than any real expectation of winning damages. What mattered was the Italian extradition case, and there, Nedzelsky was holding his ground. Living in Italy as a wanted fugitive required certain adjustments. He couldn't travel freely. His passport was surely flagged in international databases, and leaving Italy risked arrest in any other EU country. He had to maintain his registered address and probably report to authorities periodically. He needed money, which meant maintaining access to his criminal organization's funds even while physically separated from Ukraine. He needed lawyers, and good Italian lawyers don't work cheap. But these were manageable problems for someone with Nedzelsky's resources and experience. He'd been evading justice for 15 years. He'd survived multiple attempts to destroy his criminal career. He'd been arrested and released in 3 different countries. Italy was just the latest chapter. The Italian legal culture worked in his favor. Italy takes defendant rights seriously, perhaps more seriously than many countries. Extradition to non-EU countries requires extensive review to ensure the requesting country's justice system meets minimum standards. Ukraine's system, while improving, still had issues with corruption, prison conditions, and fair trial guarantees. Nedzelsky's lawyers could argue that sending him to Ukraine would violate his human rights, particularly given the war with Russia creating additional chaos in Ukrainian institutions. These arguments might not ultimately succeed, but they bought time, and time was valuable. Public information about Nedzelsky's daily life in Italy is limited. He wasn't spotted dining in Rome's fancy restaurants the way he'd been seen in Athens. He kept a lower profile, perhaps learning from his mistake in Greece, where his visibility may have contributed to his eventual arrest. Turin is a major city with significant immigrant communities where someone could blend in more easily than in a small town. His lawyer's office address suggests he stayed in or around Turin, Italy's 4th largest city, known for its industrial history and proximity to the French and Swiss borders. Did he live comfortably? Almost certainly. Did he continue managing Ukrainian criminal operations remotely? Probably, though details of how one runs an organized crime network from Italian exile aren't readily available. The Croatian gathering's decision to restore his status helped with this. Other thieves-in-law and criminal authorities would recognize his legitimacy again, making it easier to conduct business, resolve disputes, and maintain control over operations and money flows. His supporters in Ukraine could act with confidence that they served a properly recognized authority. New criminals looking to align themselves with powerful patrons would consider Nedzelsky viable again. The criminal world's approval mattered more for his practical ability to function than any legal proceeding in Kyiv or Turin. Back in Ukraine, the trial ground forward through 2024 and into 2025. More witnesses testified. More evidence was submitted. The defense continued challenging the prosecution's case. Appeals on procedural matters created delays. The case was complex enough and the defendant absent enough that quick resolution was unlikely. Ukrainian courts are notoriously slow, even for straightforward cases with cooperative defendants. A murder trial in absentia against a fugitive thief-in-law accused of crimes from 2009 would take years to fully resolve through all possible appeals. Nedzelsky's legal situation as of early 2025 was a strange equilibrium. He was free in Italy, but couldn't leave without arrest risk. He was being tried for murder in Ukraine, but wasn't present for the trial. He was sanctioned by Ukrainian government, but those sanctions meant little while he remained abroad. His status as thief-in-law had been suspended, then restored, then questioned, then reconfirmed. He controlled criminal operations, but couldn't personally oversee them. He had money, but spent significant portions on lawyers. He'd evaded justice, but remained under constant threat of extradition. It was a precarious freedom, dependent on Italian courts continuing to delay or deny Ukraine's extradition requests. For the victims and their families, this situation represented the failure of justice. Oleksandr Semenov was murdered in 2009. His family waited 15 years for someone to be held accountable. When Ukrainian prosecutors finally charged Nedzelsky in 2020, it seemed like progress. But then he fled. Then he was arrested in Italy. Then he was released. Then trial began without him present. Then the proceedings dragged on with no verdict. At what point does delayed justice become denied justice? The Semenov family couldn't answer that, but they felt it. The case also highlighted broader issues in Eastern European criminal justice. Wealthy criminals with international connections can evade consequences in ways poor domestic criminals cannot. Someone committing street robbery in Kyiv goes to prison quickly. Someone orchestrating contract murder but having money for lawyers and escape routes can delay accountability for decades or escape it entirely. This isn't unique to Ukraine. Italy itself has struggled with mafia prosecutions for generations, but it remains frustrating for societies trying to establish rule of law. For Nedzelsky personally, the question was whether this equilibrium could last. Italian courts would eventually rule on extradition one way or another. If they ruled in Ukraine's favor, his options would narrow dramatically. Appeal to European Court of Human Rights, perhaps, but ultimately he'd face either extradition or permanent imprisonment in Italy for violating whatever conditions were placed on him. If Italian courts ruled against extradition, Ukraine would be furious but helpless, and Nedzelsky could potentially live out his life in comfortable Italian exile, a fugitive who won by outlasting prosecutors. Neither outcome seemed imminent in early 2025, so the waiting continued. The story of Andriy Nedzelsky reveals something fundamental about organized crime in post-Soviet space. It's a world where violence and bureaucracy intertwine, where ancient criminal traditions meet modern financial systems, where international borders create opportunities for those willing to exploit them. To understand where Nedzelsky stands now requires understanding the larger context of thieves-in-law culture and its evolution over the past 3 decades. The thieves-in-law tradition emerged in Stalin's gulags during the 1930s and 1940s. It was originally a counterculture among Soviet prisoners, a code that rejected cooperation with authorities and emphasized solidarity among criminals. The original vori v zakone, thieves-in-law, refused to work for prison authorities, wouldn't serve in the military, rejected family ties, and devoted themselves entirely to criminal life. They settled disputes among prisoners, maintained order in the camps, and enforced a strict code of behavior. This code was passed down through generations of Soviet criminals, creating a parallel power structure within the prison system and later in wider Soviet society. The Soviet collapse in 1991 changed everything. Suddenly, the closed Soviet system opened to the world. Borders became porous, money flowed in new directions, state control weakened. Into this chaos stepped the thieves-in-law and their associates, transitioning from prison-based hierarchy to controlling major criminal operations, extortion, fraud, smuggling, drug trafficking, even legitimate businesses acquired through intimidation or front companies. The 1990s saw explosive growth in organized crime across former Soviet states. The traditional thieves' code began breaking down as money became more important than prison credentials. New criminals were crowned who'd never served time. Business considerations overshadowed ideological purity. By the 2000s and 2010s, when Nedzelsky rose to power, the thieves-in-law world had split into multiple factions. Traditional purists insisted on maintaining old standards: prison time, rejection of cooperation with authorities, strict adherence to the code. Modernizers argued the world had changed and the code needed adapting to new realities. Ethnic tensions emerged between Slavic criminals, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Caucasian criminals, Georgian, Azerbaijani, Chechen, Armenian. Geographic divisions created regional power bases. The result was constant conflict, not just between criminals and law enforcement, but between different criminal factions fighting for authority, territory, and the right to define what being a thief-in-law actually meant. Looking at Nedzelsky's trajectory from 1973 birth to 2025, certain patterns emerge. He was born in Soviet Union under Brezhnev, came of age during Gorbachev's reforms and Soviet collapse, built his criminal career in the chaotic 1990s, consolidated power in the 2000s, reached criminal elite status in 2012, survived multiple challenges through the 2010s, and entered the 2020s as international fugitive fighting extradition. His life spanned enormous historical changes, and he adapted to each. When the Soviet system collapsed, he saw opportunity and seized it. When Ukrainian criminal world evolved, he positioned himself advantageously. When law enforcement pressure increased, he fled abroad. When criminal rivals attacked, he survived and counterattacked politically. Was he smart? Clearly, yes. Stupid people don't build criminal empires. Was he ruthless? The murder charge and brutal reputation suggest yes. Was he lucky? Absolutely. Many criminals with similar ambitions ended up dead or imprisoned. Nedzelsky threaded the needle between effective violence and restraint, between visibility and obscurity, between power and vulnerability. He made mistakes. The Fairmont incident showed him politically vulnerable. The multiple arrests showed his security wasn't perfect. The murder charge revealed investigators had more evidence than he assumed. But he recovered from mistakes that destroyed other criminals' careers. His future remained uncertain. The Italian legal system would eventually rule, one way or another. If extradited, he faced Ukrainian trial and likely conviction and long imprisonment in harsh conditions. If not extradited, he faced comfortable but constrained exile, unable to return home but free in Europe. Either way, his active career running Ukrainian criminal operations was probably over. He was 52 years old in 2025, past his prime for hands-on criminal activity. The world had changed. His Croatian restoration showed he still had juice in the thieves-in-law community, but practical power required physical presence and direct control of operations. From Turin, he could perhaps advise, approve major decisions, collect tribute, maintain relationships. But the day-to-day criminal business would fall to others. The younger generation of Ukrainian criminals watched his example and drew lessons. Some saw him as a success story, rose from nothing to criminal elite, evaded prosecution for decades, lived well despite obstacles. Others saw him as a cautionary tale, made enemies who destroyed his status, had to flee homeland, faced trial and potential life sentence, paid enormous legal fees just to maintain precarious freedom. Both interpretations contained truth. Nedzelsky succeeded by criminal world standards, accumulating power and wealth that most criminals never achieve. But he also failed to secure permanent safety, and his legacy would likely be determined by whether he died free in Italy or imprisoned in Ukraine. For historians and criminologists studying post-Soviet organized crime, Nedzelsky represented a type: the ambitious second-generation criminal who exploited systemic weaknesses to build power across multiple spheres. He wasn't pioneer like the original 1990s crime bosses who established territories through extreme violence. He wasn't traditional thief-in-law forged in Soviet prisons. He was hybrid, businessman criminal who understood both old codes and new opportunities, who could navigate both underworld politics and international borders, who built empire through combination of violence, corruption, and intelligence.